Hello, and we're back for another discussion on African literature. Last time we talked about the abuses that these African people have received. Historically, they have gone through a lot with African slavery, the different torture devices and methods, and even laws that went against these African people that were kidnapped and brought to the United States. This time, let's discuss on the literature, more specifically on African poetry as a cry for social justice. So at the end of the lesson, you are expected to show exemplary knowledge in dissecting and analyzing poetry written by African poets, understand the connection of historical events and literature, and of course, you would be able to relate on the sufferings and how this work of literature or poems or any African literature has become a medium for them to cry for justice and equality. So let's first begin with figurative language. What is figurative language? It is a group of words used to add color to a certain writing. It should not be taken literally as there is a deeper meaning to it, a symbolism, using other subjects or objects to compare something or someone. So for example, when you say abused slaves, you can say these are dogs beaten by their masters. So that's an example of figurative language. And I think since you've gotten through high school and senior high school, you already know what figurative language is, and there are the different figurative phrases or figurative terms. So before we begin our discussion, I would like to have a short activity. So you can choose one among these words and write a short phrase that can symbolize these words. So you can choose between freedom, equality, and slavery. At the bottom here, you can see the criteria or the rubric for your grading. So content, this is explanation and answer that contains significant points and ideas. It's 5 points. For creativity, it's the usage of creative language. So that's 10 points all in all. So 5 points each. You can choose between freedom, equality, and slavery. Just make your own figurative language or figurative phrase in the comments under this video. Now let's begin with our discussion. So in the 19th century writings of African literature, there is a terminology or a phrase that we call the negritude movement. In the early 19th century, African writers have used newspapers to air their views. The negritude movement was a literary movement of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and it began among French-speaking African and Caribbean writers living in Paris as a protest against French colonial rule. And one of the writers who led the movement was Leopold Senghor. Now, who is this person? Now, Leopold Senghor was Senegal's first president. Senegal is located in West Africa and they were colonized by the French. And of course, there were a lot of abuses as well. He is also a poet, a statesman, and a teacher, and he became a great factor in negritude. And as I've said before, negritude was a literary movement against the French rule. One of his works was entitled Assassinations. This is a poem that we will be discussing further on and we will be analyzing and dissecting. So Leopold Senghor was considered as a voice against the abuse of African people. Now, Assassinations. This is a poem, again, written by Leopold Senghor, and it narrates the abuses and murders of the African people. The poem is littered with symbolism, and it's best to be able to understand the deeper meaning of the poem. When it comes to poems with a historical reference, you would need a deeper process in poetry analysis. So don't forget that. When analyzing a poem, it is important to remember that poems convey a message. Poets will try to use creative and lyrical language to express their emotions and opinions on a given subject. To be able to easily understand a poem, one must know what the poem is about. In the case of African poetry, one should know their references. So, African poetry or African literature is when history meets literature. You already know a little bit of what these African slaves or these African people have experienced in the past 17th to 18th century. So that's enough to really understand most of their works of literature. I know that you've already had a little background from high school, senior high school, and even in your early literature subjects on how to analyze a poem, but let's go ahead and have a refresher for that. So first one, you have to know the title. It is the easiest way to understand and analyze a poem and finding a general topic through its title. So these are a few questions that I want you to ask yourself. Does the title give you a visual image? Are the words used positive or negative? Is it lengthy or simple? The second one is a speaker. So if the title is vague, you can move towards the speaker. And here are some guide questions. Who is talking? Can you visualize an old person or a child? What is the social status of this person? With the help of the phrases, can you imagine how the person looks like? The third one is tone and mood. So once you have a general view of what the poem is about through the title and the speaker, try to get the mood and tone of the phrases. Some poems may seem like it's grieving and others may seem like it's singing. It's joyful. So here are the guide questions. Are the words used positive, happy words, or negative, violent or sad words? Do the scenarios in each phrase show love, happiness, or lamentation, sadness? Another proven and tested way in analyzing a poem is paraphrasing. So it is a great way to analyze any work of literature, especially poetry. To be able to paraphrase, one must have a dictionary. Again, as I've said before, poets love using creative language, lyrical language, and even words that aren't used in daily conversation. So a dictionary comes really handy for complex words or phrases. Paraphrasing means to simplify complicated phrases. So when you go paraphrasing poetry, it does not mean getting the literal phrase. Rather, it is dissecting the words and phrases to find a deeper meaning. And of course, we have the theme. This is the last of the list. And for you to be able to get the theme of the poem, you need to check all of your analysis. The theme may be an issue, a universal fact, or a conflict. So you need to ask yourself, what is the poem talking about? Who is speaking in the poem? What type of situation is the poem trying to show its readers? How do you, as a reader, feel when reading the poem? Now, the moment that you get all of these and you answer all of these questions, then you will be able to get the theme. Now, the theme can be a word, a general phrase, or even a short sentence. Now let's analyze together. We have Assassinations by Leopold Senghor. They lie there, stretched out by the captive roads, along the roads of disaster. The lean poplars, the statues of the dark gods, draped in their long gold coats. Senegalese prisoners miserably lying on the French land. In vain they cut your laughter. In vain, the blacker the flower, the blacker your flesh. You are the flower of beauty among the first absence, nude flowers. Black flower blossom, and its sombre smile, diamond of a time immemorial. You are the mud and plasma of the world's leafy spring. From the primitive couple, you are the flesh of the womb, the belly fertilizing milt. You are the sacred profusion of bright, blissful gardens, and the sovereign forests, victorious of fire and lightning. The vast song of your blood will defeat machines and cannons, your speech throbbing deceptions and lies. No hate in your soul. You are not hateful. No cunning. Soul without cunning. O black martyrs, immortal race, let me say the words that forgive. And that ends the poem. Now let's analyze together. Now let's start to analyze this. First, let's pick the title, Assassinations. Now, based on the title itself, you can already tell that this depicts a negative connotation. Assassinations mean violence or murder. Now, the speaker here is a man, most probably Leopold Senghor, who is recalling the pains of his ancestors or the African slaves and showing his respect for them. The tone and mood here at the very first stanzas, it's filled with sadness and negativity or violence, but at the end it changes to that of hope and inspiration. The theme here is African slave murders and oppression and how their sacrifices became an inspiration, especially to the poet or the author. Now let's start with the first stanza. They lie there, stretched out by the captive roads, along the roads of disaster. They here, they're talking about the bodies of the African slaves. When you say captive roads, it seems like these are the roads that were colonized by the French. When they say they were lying stretched out by the captive roads, it sort of shows death because who in their right mind would lie down in the middle of the road? Roads of disaster. Disaster in itself is a negative word as well. So this is an example or a photo of how they look like most probably. Now let's go to the second line. The lean poplars, the statues of the dark gods, draped in their long gold coats. Poplars are trees common in North America but can also be found in Africa. They usually have a golden color to it as its leaves are sometimes yellow. So these are an example of poplar trees. When you say draped in their long gold coats, if you can see here in this photo, gold is somewhat the shade of yellow. So they're not literally wearing coats, but it seemed like they are coated with something that's gold or yellow. And these are the poplars that are standing straight, like statues, like a symbolism for dark gods. And even the phrase dark gods show negativity, something that's ominous, something that's death. When you say dark, dark really is the opposite of light. So it kind of shows negativity. And the last line, Senegalese prisoners. Senegalese prisoners or Senegal is a location mostly populated by Africans and ruled by the French. Now, Senegalese prisoners miserably lying on the French land. So again, it was already considered as French land, mainly because this was colonized by the French around that time. And they were miserably lying. So miserably is an adjective that depicts or connotes negativity, miserable or sad. And when they're lying down, they're probably dead or dying. Now let's move on to the next stanza. In vain they cut your laughter. In vain, the blacker the flower, the blacker your flesh. Cut your laughter. The slaves are likened to flowers who are cut or killed. The line, they cut your laughter, when you say laughter, it depicts joy. And if they are cut, that means that these oppressors took away the happiness of these slaves. In vain, the blacker the flower, the blacker your flesh. Now we know that there aren't really black flowers that exist, or they're not really that common. So again, these are symbolisms of the slaves. Black flowers. The darker your flowers, the darker their flesh. Because mostly slaves were nude or naked. They were not clothed. You are the flower of beauty among the first absence. Nude flowers. And as I've said before, nude flowers because most slaves are unclothed or improperly dressed. You can see that they are considered as beauty among the first absence. Black flower blossom and its somber smile. Now, when you say somber, it means gloomy or serious. The phrase somber smile is an opposition. When you talk about smile, it's supposed to show happy. But when you have an adjective that says somber or gloomy, it just shows sadness. So it's more or less like a sad smile. The next one is diamond of a time immemorial. Diamonds are considered as unbreakable. They're one of the toughest stones or gems around. And when you say immemorial, it's timeless. So both of them show that they go against time. They are strong, unbreakable. They are even or unbreakable even through time. Now the next phrase or stanza, it depicts positivity of who these oppressed slaves are. It describes them. You are the mud and plasma of the world's leafy spring. So when you say leafy spring, they are the symbol of life. But the description says they are the mud and plasma. So here we have leaves or plants or seedlings sprouting from the soil. So even if they are mud and plasma, they are dirt, there is something beautiful that comes out from them. This is considered as a symbol of life, growth. From the primitive couple, you are the flesh of the womb, the belly fertilizing milt. Now, milt is a semen from a fish, but they use it as a symbol of life. When you say belly fertilizing, it fertilizes the belly, it creates life. They are considered that, despite the description of them being a primitive couple. You are the sacred profusion of bright, blissful gardens. When you say profusion, it's a mixture of beautiful gardens. And you are the sovereign forest, victorious of fire and lightning. When they say sovereign, it means royal. So they are considered strong and victorious of fire and lightning, meaning the forests still stand despite going through fire and going through lightning. So they have survived both fires, forest fires, and lightning or storms, which is a symbolism of the abuses that they have experienced. Now we have the last stanza, the final part of the poem. The first line goes, "The vast song of your blood will defeat machines and cannons." Blood here is a symbol for death. It literally means that they are abused, and the extent of their abuse equates to the strength that can defeat machines and cannons. So you can just really imagine how much bloodshed there was during the time wherein it was enough to even defeat machines and cannons. Your speech throbbing deceptions and lies, but there is no hate in your soul. You are not hateful. There's no cunning. Soul without cunning. It means that these slaves do not have hate nor cunning. That means being deceitful. In their soul, they are pure. And now we go to the last line. O black martyrs, immortal race, let me say the words that forgive. We all know that martyrs are people who are killed for their beliefs. These are innocent, sinless, or probably pure individuals who were murdered and killed. This is such an appropriate word to describe the African slaves who were mostly innocent and they were killed for their beliefs. The phrase words that forgive, it shows a sign of sadness and bittersweet peacefulness. You can see that the speaker here in this poem was the one who would represent these African slaves and say that they have, in fact, forgiven, which means they are again not at fault or without sin. So what is the message here? In conclusion, the poem starts off with the abuse of the slaves. You can see the description very vividly in the first stanzas. This is where the title comes from. But towards the end, the mood changes to that of hope. It even changes to strength. It speaks of how the deaths and sacrifices these people made were not forgotten, and that it paved the way for hope of a better future. Let's talk about research. Unlike other poems with a general subject or those that are dedicated to a specific person, poems with historical reference need research and understanding of the events that transpired. There are a lot of symbolism and reference to a certain object, scenario, or norm. So it's good that we've actually had a, a little bit of knowledge about the abuses that these African slaves have experienced historically for us to be able to relate how painful this poem is about. In most cases, the themes that usually surround African literature are freedom, justice, equality, oppression, lamentation. Although, like other types of literature, there are also works that depict history and culture, but they're nothing compared to the works of African authors and poets that cry for social justice. And it's still happening now. There are still so many works of literature that still calls for social justice. To this day, they are still fighting. Although there may be voices, and there are a lot of them now in high-ranking positions, these are influential people with their voices that can reach different parts of the world. They are still far from being heard. It's still a long way to go. In the media, there are a lot of news about racism and abuse against these people, but with the help of other races, they still cry for justice and they keep the fight going. This ends my discussion on African poetry as a cry for social justice. Let's not forget to be kind to one another, to different races, and to always remember that each and every one of us deserves equality. May all of you have a good day, and may we have a blessed 2021.